Have you ever seen that comedy sketch where a woman goes in to see a doctor and she's complaining of a terrible headache? She's tried paracetamol, she's tried head massages, reflexology, she's tried lovely essential oils, going away on a retreat to cure her headache. She's just exhausted and nothing is working. And the doctor says to her, "What about the nail?" And she's got a 4-inch nail sticking out of her forehead. And she keeps saying, no, it's definitely not the nail. There's definitely something else going on. And I remember laughing at it. It was totally brilliant. But at some point while I was watching it, I just realised I've done exactly that. When I had 3 small children doing several different roles, ill relatives, family crisis, doing everything to try and fix anything. And what was really wrong was that I was totally overwhelmed and I was way beyond my capacity, way beyond what I could cope with. Because when life and work feel overwhelming, what do? Well, we download a meditation app. We start doing extra journaling. We practice gratitude. We promise to spend more and more time out in nature. Sign up for yoga, go on retreats, buy yet another productivity book, or maybe colour code the calendar. And I have done every single one of those things. And listen, they're not stupid, right? Those are really important things. And I still do a lot of those. Right? Meditation really helps. Gratitude helps. Exercise helps. Time off helps. It all helps. They help you regulate. But they don't remove the nail from your head. And sometimes the issue isn't that you're just dysregulated and you need more meditation. It's just that you're working a 55, 60, 65-hour week and then telling yourself that the problem is your nervous system. Of course you're tired. Of course you're waking up at 3 a.m. with your heart racing, and of course your brain isn't going to switch off. Because if the demand exceeds your natural capacity, then not coping, your distress, is not a dysfunction, it's information. Yet so many of us feel so ashamed when we don't cope. Now, struggling with an impossible workload is not a character flaw, and it's not a deficit of your resilience. It's your human nervous system responding appropriately. And in this Quick Step episode, I'm going to give a bit of a reality check. Now, there's a line from Oliver Burkeman, author of 4,000 Weeks, that I come back to again and again. In that book, he says, when he's talking about excessive work, excessive workload, he says it's not just that this situation feels impossible. In strictly logical terms, it really is impossible. It can't be the case that you must do more than you can do. That notion doesn't make any sense. Now, that's not a motivational quote. That's just pure maths. You can't fit 25 hours of work into 24 hours a day. But many of us just say, I have no choice, I have to try. But you can't. And here's another line that I often quote because it really stuck with me. Byron Katie often says this. She says, well, you can argue with reality, but 100% of the time, reality is going to win. And that's the bit that's really uncomfortable for me, because I'm often arguing with reality. In fact, all the time I'm arguing with reality. I shouldn't feel this tired. And, well, other people cope, therefore I should cope. And, well, I used to manage this okay, therefore I need to manage it okay now. You know, it's just medicine. Hundreds of people do this job. You know, I signed up for this, I'm paid well. Someone has to do it. Now, all of this is true, or partially true, but none of it increases your actual capacity or gives you more than 24 hours in a day. And remember, you've also got to sleep and do an awful lot of other stuff. So you can turn it into a moral failing. You can compare yourself to other people. You can make yourself far more disciplined. You can just carry on, but reality will still win and something will give. Now, it might be patient care. You might find yourself making mistakes at work with patients or with clients or with your teammates. But often it's not the work mistakes you have to worry about. And here's something that I've learned in the past couple of months that has really stuck with me. Now, I often talk about the stress curve. That's the Yerkes-Dodson pressure performance curve, which shows what happens to your performance under increasing pressure. Of course, at first, your performance starts to go up under increasing pressure, but soon it plateaus off. And as the pressure builds, your performance just drops off. So it's this bell-shaped curve. Now, we understand that in burnout, our performance goes down. But when I was talking to Dr. Richard Duggins, who's been on a past You're Not Frog episode, he talked about the burnout cliff, that actually in high-stakes, high-stress professionals, they keep functioning at work. Their performance doesn't go down until they hit this performance cliff. And I said to him, well, I don't understand, because this Yerkes-Dodson curve, we've been using it for years. Does it mean that the curve is wrong? And he said, no. What happens? You think about that curve as your overall performance. But if your performance is staying steady at work, something else has got to give. So often what gives is your home life. You borrow from your evenings, your sleep, your exercise, your hobbies, or your relationships. Your relationship with your children, your partner. You borrow from intimacy, you borrow from your rest so that you can keep your performance going at work. And doctors and other professionals, we will keep our performance going at work and sacrifice everything else. And this will work to the point, and then you'll just reach this cliff and suddenly you'll drop down and go off the burnout cliff. So on paper, it looks like you're coping. It looks like you genuinely can do the 60-hour work week, and your clinical work, well, it might be fine. Your patients might be safe and your colleagues will respect you, and you look like you're delivering stuff. And because your performance at work is still intact, you'll tell yourself it's manageable, but your partner will be feeling it. Your kids will notice you're distracted all the time, and mine have noticed so many times, and they're talking to me and I'm just looking at emails or messages and my head is still at work. Or you're cancelling plans with friends, or perhaps you're snappy and irritable, and you stop doing the things that really bring you joy in life. And here's the really unfortunate bit. Often, we only start to panic when our performance at work starts to drop, and we just ignore the erosion that's going on everywhere else. And we don't often call it a problem when our home life is really suffering. We often call it dedication and professionalism and a busy season, although it's never normally a season, is it? It's often going on for years. And one day the borrowing just catches up, and when your work finally does start to suffer, then that's when we say something's wrong, or our colleagues start to challenge us. The problem is that cliff edge of the burnout cliff that Dr. Richard Duggins talks about, it didn't appear overnight. It was gradual. You were gradually easing towards it. And even though burnout can look like a dramatic collapse, it's only because there's nothing left to borrow from. It's been going on for weeks, months, even years. And that's why this really, really matters. Because what happens if nothing changes? I just want to offer a bit of a reality check. And this episode, it's not here to reassure you that everything's going to be okay. Sorry about that. It's actually here to help you face reality and look really clearly. Because if nothing changes, where does this lead? In 5 years' time, what will your health be like? What will your relationships be like? And what will have changed about the way you feel about your work? And it's not going to happen dramatically, but it will happen really steadily. And so what we need is some courage, not to quit everything and leave. That's not what I'm asking. It's the courage to actually look at what's going on. And also the courage to stop denying there's a problem or soothe yourself with, I just need to cope better, or it's going to be better when I get a couple more colleagues, when we finally manage to get another partner or a decent practice manager. I think many of us avoid doing anything about it because sometimes it can be easier to stay in the known discomfort than the unknown uncertainty. Because actually questioning what I'm doing, questioning my workload, it feels a bit dangerous. Because if I truly admit that the work is unsustainable, I can't carry on like this, then what are my choices? And we can also beat ourselves up by telling ourselves, even questioning it, feels selfish, ungrateful, disloyal, letting people down, or admitting we can't hack it. And that feels shameful. It feels like admitting we're not good enough, even though we know that no one would be able to cope with a workload like that for very long. So we sort of do something that feels a bit safer to our nervous system. So we try and do more things just to cope. And we try to solve an overload problem without actually dealing with the overload. So we try and meditate ourselves out of a 60-hour work week. It'll help a bit, but it's not going to solve the problem. nor is becoming more disciplined or more productive. And we lie to ourselves that if we were a bit more calmer, a bit more intentional, more organised, this would be manageable. And I have lost count of the amount of books, the amount of systems, everything I've tried to put into my life to try and overcome just what is too much to do. A workload problem. And in fact, when I was talking to AI and asking them to give me this sort of brutally honest assessment of how I was doing, they came out with a line that was absolutely gutting. It said, you keep trying to systematise your way out of a chronic yes problem. So I'm looking for systems, for ways of being more efficient that's going to mean I can continue to do everything rather than make those difficult choices. And this is where I need to be really honest. I have tried doing all the right things, the mindfulness and the journaling and the planning. They did help a bit, but nothing changed until I was willing to change things, to actually stop doing some things I wanted to do. And until I was willing to tolerate the discomfort of leaving some of the work that felt really important and willing to face what it was really costing me. And I got to a point in my business where I had so much to do. I just couldn't do it all, but I was trying to because I didn't want to let my colleagues down. I didn't want to let my podcast listeners down. I didn't want to let the people that had booked me for speaking down. I was trying to manage it all. And I remember talking to my psychiatrist. I was having an ADHD review, and she started asking me questions about anxiety and depression, because some of what I was feeling really looked like depression. Mostly it was sustained overload and stress. Because when demand exceeds capacity for long enough, it does look like all sorts of things, especially anxiety, depression, and burnout. So you can get low mood and irritability and numbness and anxiety and detachment. And if you have any of these symptoms, please, please, please go and speak to a doctor about it. But sometimes it's not pathology that's going on. Sometimes it's a maths problem. You're trying to cram too much into something that actually won't go. What do you do with all of this? So I'm going to suggest right now, don't fix it, but don't panic. Don't make any dramatic decisions. The first step is just to stop guessing, because a lot of the time we don't actually know what is on our plate. It's like I've recently wanted to start eating a lot more healthily, and I've started keeping a food diary. And you know what? I never really realised exactly what I was eating and how erratic my eating habits were until I saw it written down. Nothing's changed in the way I'm eating. I'm just seeing it. And with that food diary, I've looked at it and gone, oh, that's why I tend to have these massive sugar crashes late in the afternoon. That explains it, rather than beating myself up for feeling really hungry and then going for the really unhealthy snacks. Most of us have never actually seen what actually goes on in our working week. So we just experience it in little fragments about, working that extra evening or Sunday afternoon, or checking emails in bed, or finishing up and catching up. So we don't actually recognise it's 60 hours. It just feels like a lot of small necessary things. So if you want to start somewhere with all of this, don't start with a massive big change. Start with clarity, because the first step to being able to solve all this is actually knowing what you're dealing with. So why don't you start with mapping out your actual week, every single session you work, every time you have paperwork, every time you check your emails, do any admin, every time you have a conversation with a colleague or have to support a trainee, every teaching session, every bit of work you do at home, put it in black and white. We've provided a tool called the Thrive Week Planner that you can download and use to do this. I used this while I was coaching a GP. He'd come to me saying, I'm so overloaded, I just want to get my day off. And we'd looked at his workload, we'd mapped it out on a week's calendar, what a typical working week for him looked like. And he told me he thought he was working 7 or 8 sessions. And after we'd put down every single thing that he was doing, including being a partner, being an associate specialist at the local hospital, being a praiser, doing all sorts of other stuff. And when he did it, he just looked at his plan and I said, well, what do you notice? He said, I appear to be working about 12 sessions a week. Not 7, not 8. So no wonder he wasn't getting his day off. So it's really helpful just to get it out there. You're not judging it. You're not redesigning your life. First of all, you're just going to see it. Because it's really hard to argue with reality once it's written down, and then you know what you're coping with. Now, you may be thinking, okay, I get it, high workload, It's too much. We all know it's too much, but it's never going to change. In fact, it's only going to get worse. So what's the point of even looking? And I get it. And underneath that, you may be feeling one of three things. Firstly, really hopeless. That's just it. The system is broken. It's never going to improve. And yeah, that might be the case. You might also be feeling a bit scared. If I admit that this is unsustainable, I might have to do something drastic. I might have to leave. I might have to disappoint people. I might have to have conversations I don't want to have. And what would I do anyway? Okay, so that sometimes means that we don't even start to look at the problem. But, that is like way, way down the line. And there's lots of things you could do before you get to that point. The third response you might have to that is just avoid looking at it at all. Sometimes just freezing, as in that fight, flight or freeze response, thinking it's just safer not to know. And if I don't look too closely, I'm just going to put my head down and keep going. And all of that makes sense. But getting clear, it's not about being unduly optimistic and believing that the road is magically going to improve. And it's also not about fixing the system. It's just about working out what you're doing unconsciously. What are you sacrificing unconsciously? Because if nothing changes, if the workload remains the same, you have two options. Option one, you can ignore that nail and you can continue borrowing from the rest of your life without noticing, cancelling all your plans, keep working in the evening, losing patience and narrowing down your world. And keep telling yourself that it's fine because your performance at work still looks intact, but you will be edging nearer that burnout cliff. The second option is actually make a conscious decision. Decide what the work is allowed to take from you. And you're not being really dramatic, but you're just being really deliberate. You could say, I realise that if I'm going to choose to stay with this workload, I will never get to play tennis on a Thursday evening. Or I will realise that this hobby is unrealistic for me. If I continue with this work, you've chosen it, it's conscious. And that might be enough. You see, clarity doesn't guarantee change, but it does stop you drifting towards that burnout cliff. And, we think the burnout cliff sounds like you go over suddenly, but actually you are slowly going towards that and adjusting and compensating until one day, there's no performance at home left to borrow and you go off the cliff. And this is where it gets a bit existential because you can survive like this for years. But the question here is, well, what version of you survives? And if nothing changes, the question does become, what am I willing to exchange for this? My health, my sleep, my relationships, my presence with my children, who I am outside work. And that's not a question about productivity. That's a life question. You might think the exchange is worth it. I've got a colleague who just loves working. He said if he could, he'd work 24 hours a day, and that is all he wants to do. But he's chosen that. It's conscious. Let it be chosen, but not accidental, and not based on denial and refusing to look at what's going on. So clarity isn't about fixing the system. It's about your own conscious consent to what is going on. Now, here is another option. Here's a third option. You could look clearly at what's going on and you could decide, well, I'm not willing to let this take my health, or I'm not willing to keep borrowing from my life to keep up my performance at work. And then something very important shifts, and it's not the system, it's you. Because what you're doing, you're not consenting to this unlimited sacrifice and this erosion of everything else in your life. Because once you've stopped consenting to this sacrificing your life outside of work, you can't really continue unconsciously, and you're going from drifting towards that burnout cliff to actually choosing. And that does not mean resigning tomorrow. It means that you stop pretending that everything is equally non-negotiable. When I was in that period of overwhelm, I had a good friend and colleague, and he sat me down in front of a whiteboard and he said, right, let's list out everything that is on your plate, Rachel, everything that you think is non-negotiable and you have to do. And we listed out everything. And just by talking to him for an hour, we crossed off at least a third of them. And believe me, they were really important at the time. But if you'd have asked me, I would have said I couldn't possibly drop them. But having that permission from somebody else was really, really helpful. And we've also put the Overwhelm SOS toolkit in the show notes that if you want to go through that exact system that I use, you can do it, like getting everything out and thinking, what can I just drop and what can I let go of right now? Because when you stop telling yourself there is no choice, you start asking different questions. And the questions aren't, what else do I need to do to cope better? The questions are, okay, what is actually mine to carry? What really, 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 really needs to be done rather than what really, really needs to be done? The other questions are, what have I just assumed that I must do that maybe nobody else is expecting? And what is genuinely non-negotiable and what have I simply treated as non-negotiable? And you'll be working in the same system, you might have the same rota, but you won't treat infinite sacrifice as this sort of default level of professionalism. But here's the uncomfortable bit. There is a cost. And if you decide that you aren't willing to sacrifice everything, something will have to give. Not in a really dramatic way, but just because capacity is finite and there is a cost. If you refuse to work in the evening, then that work won't get done in the evenings. If you refuse to let your health suffer, then you probably won't meet all the expectations that everybody has of you. And if you refuse to keep borrowing your performance from your family life, then yes, some work requests will have to be declined. And people might think less of you. You might even be seen to be dumping on your colleagues. And that is not being difficult. It's just maths. And that is where the real courage sits, not in quitting everything, but it's actually tolerating that discomfort of the limits that you have. And yes, you might disappoint someone. You might not be seen as being endlessly available. You won't be the superhero. But that's not failure. That's reality. And you know what? Reality wins. And side note, I do think we have this myth in medicine that, well, I'm just going to have to put up with second best in my work and my career if I decide not to sacrifice my family or my home life or everything. And I think that's a bit of a fallacy. I think that actually, if you decide what's really, really important at work, what's in your zone of genius, and you focus on that and you do less, you will do that one thing better. You'll have a better impact. And actually, that is when you'll do your best work. And genuinely, I've seen that in my own life. But right now, if you feel too tired to choose any of those options, that's okay. Clarity has got to come before action. And if this has resonated with you and you want somewhere to start, don't start with changing something, just start with getting clear. So you can download our Thrive Week Planner and map your actual week in black and white, not redesign your whole life, don't panic, just to see what's really there. And if your head feels too full to think straight, grab the Overwhelm SOS guide as well. And that's a really simple way of getting everything out of your brain onto paper so you can see what you're actually carrying. Not about fixing stuff. It's not about big decisions. It's just about clarity. Once you start to see things clearly, you'll stop trying to argue with reality. And that's where real choice really begins, and the next step will reveal itself. And when I sat in front of that whiteboard with everything that was on my mind clearly mapped out in front of me, I needed permission. I needed permission from my colleague just to leave half the stuff up there. So before we finish, let me offer you a few permissions, not to escape responsibility, but just to stop fighting reality. So you have permission to stop arguing with your own exhaustion. If you're tired, that is information, it is not weakness. You have permission to treat how you feel right now as data, not something to override with yet more self-discipline. And you have permission to stop adding and adding and adding to your coping strategies, adding all these well-being tools, tips, techniques to something else on your to-do list, because the issue isn't coping better. And you have permission, even if it's just privately, to say, this might not be doable as it stands. And you don't have to fix it today. You don't have to confront anybody. You don't have to leave, but you can stop pretending that it's doable. We need to be honest about what is. That's not self-indulgent. It's just the first step. You can argue with reality, but reality wins every single time. So the question isn't, how can I cope harder? The question is, are you willing to really look clearly at what's going on? And if you are, that's where change eventually becomes possible. But clarity comes first, always.